George Parker, a 93-year-old black veteran, had lived through many of the most tumultuous times in American history. He had served his country honorably in World War II and the Korean War, enduring both the brutality of combat and the quiet, relentless cruelty of racism from those he fought beside. George had faced enemies on the battlefield and prejudice at home, but he had never lost his hope for a better world. Despite his age, his spirit remained unbroken. He was a man of quiet dignity, respected by many in his community for his resilience and integrity. On this particular day, George drove his old, reliable pickup truck through the familiar streets of his small southern town. The truck's tires crunched along the dusty road, kicking up small clouds of red earth. He was headed to Ellen's Diner, a place he had been visiting for as long as he could remember. The diner was nestled at the center of the town, a long-standing establishment with a sign that had faded over the years but still bore the name Ellen's in bold letters. It was a place that had seen generations of townsfolk pass through its doors, seeking comfort in its hearty meals and familiar atmosphere. As George parked his truck in front of the diner, he took a moment to survey the scene. Ellen's Diner had always been a symbol of the town, a place where people gathered to share stories, laughter, and sometimes even secrets. But George knew that beneath the surface of its cheery facade, the diner also held onto the old ways of thinking that had defined the South for far too long. He sighed, his gaze lingering on the chipped paint of the door, before stepping out of his truck. Today, like every other time, he just wanted a slice of the diner's famous apple pie, something sweet and familiar, a comfort he had cherished for decades. Inside the diner, Ellen Baxter stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on a faded dish rag. Ellen was the owner of the diner, a woman whose face had grown as weathered as the sign outside. She had inherited the place from her father, who had inherited it from his, and she ran it with an iron fist. Ellen believed in order, in tradition, and in maintaining the status quo. Her attitude, shaped by her upbringing, was firm, and she held tightly onto the prejudices passed down through her family. She wore her sternness like a badge of honor, and her demeanor ensured that everyone knew who was in charge. As George opened the door, the familiar bell above it jingled, announcing his arrival. Ellen looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. The diner grew quiet, the usual chatter of patrons dying down as heads turned towards the door. George, with his hunched shoulders and steady gait, walked in slowly, feeling the weight of the stares that followed him. He nodded politely to those around him, his face betraying none of the unease he felt. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Some of the patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged quick glances with each other. George knew that not everyone in the room shared Ellen's views, but fear and complacency often kept people silent. He moved towards the counter, his eyes on the glass display where a fresh apple pie sat, its golden crust glistening under the dim lights. That pie was why he was here, a simple slice of something that reminded him of better times, a taste of warmth and sweetness that had comforted him through many hard days. He sat down at the counter, his old bones creaking as he eased onto the stool. The diner was quiet now, the silence almost oppressive. George could feel Ellen's gaze on him as he settled in, her presence behind the counter like a looming shadow. He straightened his back, determined not to let the unease push him away. He had every right to be here, just like anyone else. All he wanted was a slice of apple pie, but today there was an unmistakable chill in the air, a sense that something was about to change. George settled into his usual seat at the counter, trying to ignore the quiet tension that had filled the diner since his arrival. He could feel the eyes of the regular customers on him, and though he was no stranger to being watched, the silence today seemed heavier, more judgmental. George looked around the room, offering polite nods to familiar faces, but few returned his greeting. Most of them quickly averted their gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He sighed inwardly, his focus shifting back to the display case, where the apple pie sat, golden and inviting. Just as George was about to call out to place his order, Ellen emerged from the kitchen, her expression cold and unwelcoming. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes locking onto George with an intensity that made the air feel even more stifling. The usual warmth and friendliness that she extended to other patrons was nowhere to be seen. Instead, her lips were pressed into a tight, thin line, and her eyes seemed to hold a glare that could pierce through steel. George, ever the gentleman, smiled politely. "Afternoon, Ellen," he greeted her, his voice calm and even. "Could I trouble you for a slice of that apple pie?" Ellen's expression didn't change. She stood behind the counter, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "We're out of pie today, George," she said curtly, her tone devoid of any friendliness. The words were delivered with such finality that it almost felt like a command for him to leave. George blinked, confused. He glanced at the display case where the apple pie sat, untouched, its aroma wafting through the air. It was clear as day that the pie was fresh and ready to be served. He looked back at Ellen, his brows knitting together slightly. "But Ellen," he said gently, "I can see the pie right there. It looks like there's plenty." Ellen's eyes narrowed, and her face darkened with irritation. She stepped closer to the counter, her voice growing sharper. "I said we're out, George," she snapped, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the counter. "In fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." The diner grew even quieter, if that was possible. The silence was thick and oppressive, every eye fixed on the exchange between Ellen and George. The other patrons watched with a mix of shock, discomfort, and curiosity. Some looked away, unwilling to witness the confrontation, while others leaned in slightly, unable to tear their gaze from the scene unfolding before them. George sat still for a moment, the weight of Ellen's words sinking in. He had known Ellen for years, had been coming to her diner for as long as it had existed. Never before had he been treated like this, not here, not by her. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and tried once more. "Ellen, if I've done something to upset you, I apologize. I just wanted a slice of pie, same as always." Ellen's face twisted into a sneer, her eyes flashing with something darker, something uglier. "You've done plenty just by walking in here," she said, her voice low but filled with venom. "I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now, get out before I call the authorities." The words hit George like a physical blow. He felt his chest tighten, the pain of her rejection cutting deep. For a moment, he was transported back to his younger days, to a time when such treatment was not uncommon, when he had to fight not only on the battlefield but also against the discrimination that awaited him at home. But this was different. This was Ellen, a woman he had known for years, a place that had always been a constant in his life. He had thought he was past this, that he had earned respect through his service and his years in the community. Slowly, George rose from his seat. His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched them to steady himself. He looked around the diner, meeting the eyes of those who dared to look at him. Most of them quickly looked away, shame or discomfort evident on their faces. He turned his gaze back to Ellen, his voice soft but steady. "I see," he said, his words carrying the weight of his years and experiences. "I won't cause any trouble, Ellen. I'll go." As George began to shuffle towards the door, a young woman sitting at a nearby table stood up abruptly. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, and her voice shook as she spoke. "This isn't right," she said, her gaze shifting between Ellen and George. "You can't treat him like this. He's done nothing wrong." Ellen rounded on the young woman, her face flushed with anger. "This is my diner," she spat, her voice rising. "I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The young woman hesitated, her courage faltering under Ellen's fierce glare. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but then closed it, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Slowly, she sank back into her seat, her eyes filled with shame as she watched George continue towards the door. The bell above the door jingled softly as George pushed it open, stepping out into the bright sunlight. The air outside felt different, crisper, harsher, as if the world had changed in the few minutes he had been inside the diner. He stood there for a moment, letting the door close behind him, the muffled whispers of the patrons reaching his ears before fading away. Inside the diner, the tension remained thick. Some patrons hurriedly paid their bills and left, unwilling to support what they had just witnessed. Others stayed, either in agreement with Ellen or too stunned to move. Ellen stood behind the counter, her chest heaving slightly, her face set in a stubborn scowl. She had done what she believed was right, what her father would have wanted. But deep down, beneath the layers of pride and prejudice, there was a gnawing unease, a sense that she might have just made a terrible mistake. George made his way slowly back to his truck, his heart heavy. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel as he stared blankly ahead. The hurt and humiliation washed over him in waves, mingling with the old, familiar pain of being treated as less than human. But as he sat there, something else began to take root, a spark of determination, a refusal to let this injustice stand. George Parker was many things: a veteran, a father, a respected member of the community, but he was not a man who took injustice lying down. With a deep breath, George started the engine, the rumble of the old truck filling the silence. He knew this wasn't over. Ellen's actions today had set something in motion, something that would not be easily stopped. As he drove away, George's mind was already working, formulating a plan. He had faced far greater challenges in his life, and he wasn't about to let this one break him. Little did Ellen know, but her actions today would have consequences far beyond what she could imagine. The fight for justice was just beginning, and George Parker was ready to lead the charge. As George walked out of the diner, he felt the weight of Ellen's words pressing heavily on his heart. The door closed behind him with a jingle, but the sound barely registered. The humiliation and hurt he felt were overwhelming, and it took everything in him to keep moving forward. He took slow, measured steps towards his old pickup truck. His shoulders slumped under the burden of a pain that was all too familiar. The bright sunlight outside seemed almost mocking, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt within. George climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the steering wheel. He sat there for a long moment, staring blankly ahead, the echoes of Ellen's hateful words reverberating in his mind. "I don't serve your kind in my establishment." The words had cut deeper than he expected, reopening wounds that he had thought had long healed. He had faced this kind of hatred before, but it never got easier. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how much progress had been made, the sting of discrimination was always sharp and raw. His mind drifted back to his youth, to a time when such treatment was not only common but expected. He remembered the whites-only signs that hung in storefronts, the segregation that kept people like him on the outskirts of society. He remembered the fear, the anger, and the constant fight to be seen as human, to be treated with dignity. He remembered the first time he had been denied service, the way the people around him had looked at him, some with disdain, others with pity, but none with the courage to speak up. The pain of those memories washed over him now, mingling with the fresh hurt from Ellen's rejection. For a moment, George felt the despair threatening to consume him. He was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of the endless cycle of prejudice and hatred. He had given so much, served his country, worked hard, raised his family, and yet, here he was, still being treated as less than, still being told he didn't belong. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and he closed his eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath. He could feel the tears welling up, but he fought them back, refusing to let the pain break him. And then, slowly, something shifted within him. The despair began to give way to something else, something stronger, something that had kept him going all these years. Determination. George opened his eyes, his gaze hardening as he looked out at the diner. He had faced far worse than Ellen Baxter in his life. He had faced men with guns, men who wanted to kill him just because he was fighting for his country. He had faced hatred and violence, and he had survived. He was still here, and he was not about to let one small-minded woman push him back into the shadows. No, Ellen's actions could not go unchallenged. This was bigger than a slice of apple pie. This was about respect, about dignity, about standing up against the kind of prejudice that had held people like him down for far too long. George knew he couldn't let this go, not just for himself, but for everyone in this town who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. He had fought for freedom once, and he would fight for it again, even if the battlefield was now a small-town diner. With a renewed sense of purpose, George started the engine of his truck, the familiar rumble filling the silence around him. He glanced back at the diner one last time, a spark of determination in his eyes. He knew exactly what he had to do. This wasn't just about confronting Ellen, it was about changing the narrative, about making sure that no one else had to endure what he had just experienced. As he drove away from the diner, his mind began to formulate a plan. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had people who cared about him, people who had the power to make a difference. His granddaughter, Monica, came to mind almost immediately. Monica was a force to be reckoned with, a prominent civil rights lawyer who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice. George had always been proud of her, of the way she had taken up the mantle of change and carried it forward. She had the kind of influence that could bring real consequences to Ellen's doorstep. George smiled to himself, a sense of hope beginning to take root. He could already imagine Monica's reaction when he told her what had happened. She would be furious, of course, fury born out of love for him and a deep-seated belief in equality. But more than that, She would be ready to take action. Monica had never been one to back down from a fight, especially not when it came to her family. George knew that with her by his side, they could turn this moment of pain into a catalyst for change. The road stretched out ahead of him, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. George drove with purpose, his mind clear and focused. He wasn't sure exactly what the next steps would be, but he knew that he wouldn't be facing them alone. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ellen Baxter had made a mistake, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. As he pulled up to his house, George felt a sense of calm settle over him. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, looking at the small, cozy home he had built with his late wife. It was a place filled with memories, both joyful and bittersweet. He thought of her now, of how proud she would be of him for not backing down, for continuing to fight for what was right. George took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. He had faced many battles in his life, and this was just one more. He was ready. With a final nod to himself, George got out of the truck and headed inside. It was time to make a phone call. It was time to set things in motion. The fight for justice was just beginning, and George Parker was ready to lead the charge. This time, not with a rifle in his hands, but with the power of his voice, his story, and the support of those who loved him. Ellen Baxter had underestimated him, but she was about to learn that a 93-year-old veteran was not someone to be dismissed so easily. The fight was on, and George was ready to see it through to the end. Word spread quickly through the small town about what had happened at Ellen's diner. The news seemed to travel faster than the wind, carried from one household to another, whispered in hushed voices across fences and over coffee cups. The story of George Parker being denied service had shaken the community to its core, leaving many residents in disbelief. George was well known and well liked, a man who had given so much for his country and his community. To hear that he had been humiliated so openly, in a place as familiar as Ellen's diner, was shocking to all who heard it. Groups of neighbors gathered on porches, their voices low and filled with a mixture of outrage and sadness. "Did you hear about George?" one would ask, and another would nod gravely. "I can't believe Ellen would do something like that." The diner, once a bustling hub where people gathered for comfort food and conversation, had suddenly become the center of controversy. People who had once been loyal customers found themselves questioning whether they could continue to support a business that had treated one of their own so poorly. Ellen herself could feel the shift almost immediately. The day after the incident, she opened the diner as usual, the familiar chime of the bell above the door greeting her as she stepped inside. But the mood was different. The usual morning rush was thinner, the regular faces noticeably absent. Those who did come in seemed hesitant, their eyes flickering towards her with something that felt like judgment. Conversations were subdued, the friendly banter that normally filled the diner replaced by a strained silence. As Ellen moved about, pouring coffee and taking orders, she couldn't ignore the way people looked at her. There was a weight to their gazes, an unspoken disapproval that seemed to follow her every move. A few customers, people who had been coming to the diner for years, barely made eye contact, their smiles forced and their voices tight. Others looked at her openly, their expressions a mix of disappointment and anger. Ellen tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but deep down, she felt a growing unease. She had always prided herself on running her diner the way her father had, holding onto the values he had instilled in her. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The unease only grew as the days passed and more regulars stopped showing up. The booths that were usually full sat empty, and the sound of the bell above the door grew less frequent. Ellen tried to tell herself that it was just a phase, that people would forget and things would return to normal. But as she stood behind the counter, staring out at the nearly empty diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. Meanwhile, miles away in a bustling city, Monica Parker was at her office, buried in paperwork, when her phone rang. It was a family friend, her voice urgent and filled with emotion. "Monica, you need to know what happened to your grandfather," she said, and as she recounted the story, Monica felt her heart sink. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her beloved grandfather, a man who had faced so much in his life, being humiliated in such a way. The anger rose quickly, hot and fierce, mingling with a deep sense of heartbreak. Monica listened in silence, her jaw clenched, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. When the call ended, she sat there for a moment, trying to process the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of her grandfather, of his kindness, his strength, the way he had always been there for her. He had taught her so much about resilience, about standing up for what was right. And now, it was her turn to stand up for him. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was not something she could let slide. Her grandfather's dignity had been attacked, and she would not rest until it was restored. Monica was not just any granddaughter, she was a civil rights lawyer, and she had spent her career fighting for justice. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to make things right. Monica grabbed her phone again, her fingers moving quickly as she dialed. She called her assistant, instructing her to clear her schedule for the next few days. There was work to be done, calls to make, plans to set in motion. She was going to ensure that Ellen's actions had consequences, not just for her grandfather's sake, but for the sake of everyone in that town who had ever been made to feel like they were less than. This wasn't just about George Parker. This was about standing up to prejudice, about making sure that no one else had to endure what he had. As Monica hung up, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. She was ready to fight, ready to use every resource at her disposal to bring justice to her grandfather. Ellen Baxter had picked the wrong man to humiliate, and Monica was about to show her exactly why. The Parker family was not one to back down, and Monica would see to it that her grandfather's dignity was not only restored but celebrated. The fight had begun, and she was ready to lead the charge. Monica arrived in town late in the evening, her heart heavy with both anger and determination. The drive had been long, but her thoughts of her grandfather, George, kept her focused. She could not let this stand. The image of her beloved grandfather being humiliated in the diner, a place he had frequented for years, haunted her, and the injustice of it fueled her resolve. She pulled up to her grandfather's modest home, a place that had always been a beacon of warmth and comfort for her. As she stepped out of the car, George was already at the door, waiting. "Monica," George greeted her, his face lighting up despite the obvious weariness in his eyes. He looked tired, but there was also a glint of pride at seeing his granddaughter. Monica rushed up the steps, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tightly for a moment longer than usual. "Grandpa," she said, her voice filled with both warmth and an unspoken promise. "I'm so sorry this happened to you. I can't believe it." George smiled gently, patting her back. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said softly. "But I'm glad you're here. I knew you would come." Monica pulled back, looking into his eyes, her expression fierce. "Of course I came. And we're not letting this slide. I want to hear everything, Grandpa." They moved inside, settling into the cozy living room. George began to recount the events of that day, how he had walked into Ellen's diner, the looks he received, Ellen's coldness, her refusal to serve him, and the way she had told him to leave. As he spoke, Monica listened intently, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her jaw set in a hard line. The more George spoke, the angrier she became, not just at Ellen but at the entire system of prejudice that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. When George finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Monica looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and determination. "We can't let this go, Grandpa," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about you, it's about the entire community. People can't be allowed to treat others like this. We need to make sure she understands that what she did was wrong. Not just morally, but legally." George nodded slowly, a proud smile forming on his face. "I knew you would say that," he replied. "And you're right. This is bigger than just me." Monica took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. She reached out, taking her grandfather's hand in hers. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "we're going to Ellen's diner. And we're not going alone." The next morning, the air was crisp and cool as Monica and George stood outside Ellen's diner. They were not alone. A small group of community leaders had joined them, people who believed in justice and were willing to stand up against the wrongs they had heard about. The group included Reverend Johnson, a well-respected figure in the community, Mrs. Alvarez, a local business owner, and a few others who had come to show their support for George. They all shared the same determined expression, a sense of unity in the face of injustice. Monica looked at her grandfather, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze before she nodded to the others. Together, they walked towards the door of the diner, the bell above it jingling as they stepped inside. The room fell silent almost immediately, the few patrons who were there turning to look at the group. Ellen, who had been behind the counter, froze at the sight of them. Her eyes widened, and her face flushed slightly, though she quickly tried to compose herself. Monica stepped forward, her expression calm but unwavering. "Ellen Baxter," she said, her voice carrying through the diner. Ellen straightened, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Monica. "Yes, I'm Ellen," she replied, her voice edged with defensiveness. Monica took another step closer, her gaze never wavering. "My name is Monica Parker," she said, her tone even. "I'm George Parker's granddaughter. I'm here because I believe you owe my grandfather an apology for the way you treated him yesterday." There was a collective intake of breath from the patrons, and Ellen's face hardened. She crossed her arms over her chest, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't owe him anything," Ellen said, her voice cold. "I have the right to serve or refuse service to anyone I choose. This is my diner." Monica's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained calm. "Actually, Ellen, that's not entirely true," she said, her voice steady. "You see, what you did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. There are laws against discrimination, laws that protect people like my grandfather from being treated the way you treated him." Ellen's face flushed a deeper shade of red, and she shifted uncomfortably, her arms tightening around herself. "I run my diner the way I see fit," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I don't need you coming in here and telling me how to run my business." Monica took another step forward, her eyes locked on Ellen's. "I'm not here to tell you how to run your business, Ellen," she said, her voice growing firmer. "I'm here to demand that you take responsibility for your actions. What you did was an act of prejudice, and it hurt not only my grandfather but this entire community. You may think you can hide behind your pride, but the law is clear. Discrimination has consequences, and if you refuse to acknowledge that, then we will take this further." Ellen's confidence seemed to waver for a moment, her eyes darting to the small group standing behind Monica and George. The diner was silent, the tension thick in the air. The patrons watched, some with expressions of support, others with uncertainty. Ellen swallowed, her gaze flickering back to Monica. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Monica held her gaze, her expression unwavering. "This isn't over, Ellen," she said quietly but firmly. "You may think you can brush this aside, but I promise you, we will not stop until justice is served." With that, Monica turned, her grandfather and the rest of the group following her as they walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling once more. Ellen stood behind the counter, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She watched as they left, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily on her shoulders. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt, a sense that perhaps she had made a mistake that would not be easily undone. Outside, Monica took a deep breath, her expression softening as she looked at her grandfather. George gave her a proud smile, his eyes shining with both gratitude and admiration. "You did good, Monica," he said quietly. Monica nodded, her heart swelling with both love for her grandfather and determination to see this through. "This is just the beginning, Grandpa," she said. "We're going to make sure that people like Ellen understand that hatred and prejudice have no place here. We're going to fight, not just for you, but for everyone in this community." George nodded, a sense of hope filling him. He had faced many battles in his life, but with Monica by his side, he knew they could win this one. The small group dispersed, each person returning to their daily lives but with a renewed sense of purpose. Monica watched them go, her resolve only growing stronger. She knew this fight wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. Ellen Baxter had refused to apologize, but this was far from over. The community was waking up, and Monica was determined to lead them towards justice, one step at a time. Together, they would make sure that what happened to her grandfather would never happen again. Not here, not anywhere. Monica knew that in order to make a real difference, she needed the support of the entire community. The morning after their confrontation at Ellen's diner, she got to work, reaching out to local leaders, friends, and neighbors. She made calls, sent messages, and even went door to door, explaining what had happened to her grandfather and why it was so important for everyone to take a stand against discrimination. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were shocked, outraged, and many were eager to help. They knew George, and they respected him. The thought of him being treated so poorly struck a chord with everyone who heard the story. Within a few days, Monica had organized a community meeting at the local church. It was the same church where George had attended services for years, and its large, welcoming space had often served as a place for the town to come together in times of need. The evening of the meeting, the church hall was filled with people, Some familiar faces, others who had come out of a sense of duty or curiosity. The air was charged with a sense of anticipation, a shared understanding that they were about to embark on something important. Monica stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could see the concern and determination in their faces, and it gave her a sense of hope. She cleared her throat, her voice strong as she began. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "I know that many of you are here because you care about my grandfather, George Parker. But this isn't just about him, this is about all of us. What happened at Ellen's Diner was an act of discrimination, and if we don't stand up against it, then we are allowing it to continue. We have the power to change things, but we have to act together." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room, and Monica nodded, encouraged by their response. She turned to George, who was sitting in the front row, his hands resting on his cane. "My grandfather has something he'd like to share with you all," she said, her voice softening as she looked at him. George slowly stood up, leaning heavily on his cane as he made his way to the front of the room. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the elderly man who had seen so much in his lifetime. George took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to talk to you about what happened to me at Ellen's Diner. It wasn't the first time I've faced discrimination, and I know it won't be the last. But what hurt the most was that it happened here, in my own town, a place I've called home for so many years." He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I fought in World War II, and I fought in Korea. I fought for this country because I believed in it. I believed in the promise of freedom and equality for everyone. And yet, when I came home, I found that the fight wasn't over." The room was silent, many of the attendees listening with tears in their eyes. George continued, his voice growing stronger. "I marched in the civil rights movement. I stood up when they told me to sit down. I fought so that my children and my grandchildren wouldn't have to face the same hatred that I did. And yet, here we are. My granddaughter is here tonight because she believes in justice, and I am so proud of her. But this isn't just her fight, or my fight, it's all of ours. We have to stand together if we want to make a difference. We have to show that we will not tolerate hatred in our community." As George finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, some wiping away tears. Monica felt a swell of pride as she watched her grandfather, his shoulders straighter than they had been in days. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm as the applause died down. "Thank you, Grandpa," she said softly before turning back to the crowd. "We have a plan. We are going to stage a peaceful protest outside Ellen's Diner. We want to show that we will not accept discrimination in our town. This isn't about causing trouble. It's about standing up for what is right, about showing that we are better than this. I know that many of you have businesses to run, families to take care of, but if you can join us, even for a little while, it would mean the world to us." There were nods of agreement, people murmuring their support. Reverend Johnson, who had been sitting near the front, stood up. "I will be there," he said, his deep voice resonating through the hall. "This is about more than just one man. This is about the soul of our community. We cannot stay silent." More voices joined in, one by one, people pledging their support, promising to stand with George and Monica. The sense of unity in the room was palpable, a shared determination to do what was right. As the meeting drew to a close, Monica felt a renewed sense of hope. They had a plan, and they had the support of the community. But she knew that this was just the beginning. After everyone had left, she stayed behind, sitting down with her grandfather and Reverend Johnson. "There's something else I need to do," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I need to make sure that Ellen faces the legal consequences of her actions. What she did wasn't just wrong, it was against the law." Reverend Johnson nodded, his expression serious. "What do you need from us, Monica?" he asked. Monica smiled, grateful for his support. "I need witnesses," she said. "People who were there, who saw what happened. I want to file a formal complaint with the state, but I need statements from those who can back up what my grandfather experienced." George reached over, placing his hand on hers. "We'll get them," he said firmly. "People saw what happened. They know the truth." Monica nodded, her resolve strengthening. She had already started the process, making calls, gathering information, preparing to file the complaint. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be those who would try to dismiss what had happened or make excuses for Ellen. But she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Over the next few days, Monica worked tirelessly, meeting with those who had been at the diner, taking their statements, and preparing the paperwork. She also continued to organize the protest, coordinating with the community leaders to make sure everything would go smoothly. The response was overwhelming. People were eager to help, eager to show that their town would not stand for discrimination. The day of the protest, Monica stood outside the diner, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers who had come to support their cause. They held signs that read "No to Racism" and "Equality for All," their voices united in a call for justice. Monica looked over at her grandfather, who stood beside her, his head held high. She knew that this was just one step in a long journey, but it was an important one. They were making a statement, not just to Ellen, but to the entire community. They were showing that love and unity could overcome hatred, that they would not be silent in the face of injustice. As the protest began, Monica felt a sense of pride and hope wash over her. This was what her grandfather had fought for, what so many had fought for, a chance to be heard, to be seen, to be treated with dignity and respect. And as she stood there, surrounded by her community, she knew that they were on the right path. Together, they would make sure that what happened to George Parker would never happen again. Together, they would fight for change, one step at a time. The morning of the protest dawned clear and bright, a crispness in the air that seemed to mirror the determination of the people gathered outside Ellen's diner. Monica stood at the forefront, next to her grandfather, George. The street in front of the diner was filled with people, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard what had happened and wanted to lend their voices to the call for justice. There was a sense of unity among them, a shared belief that they were standing up for something greater than themselves. Colorful signs bobbed above the crowd, messages like "No to Racism" and "Equality for All" scrawled in bold letters. The voices of the protesters rose in a chorus of chants, their words echoing down the street, carrying with them a message that was impossible to ignore. "Justice for George," they called out, their voices strong and unwavering. It wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration that they would not tolerate hatred in their community. Inside the diner, Ellen stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the scene outside. Her hands shook slightly as she poured coffee into a mug, her face pale. She could see the crowd through the large front windows, the signs, the people, the sheer number of them. There were men and women, young and old, people of every background and race. She recognized some of her regulars among them, and her stomach twisted with a mix of anger and fear. She had never imagined that things would come to this, that her actions would lead to a protest right outside her door. Ellen's gaze shifted to George, who stood at the front of the crowd, his head held high, his presence commanding. She felt a pang of something, regret perhaps, though she quickly pushed it aside, her pride refusing to let her acknowledge it. This was her diner, her father's legacy, and she had run it the way she thought was right. But now, as she watched the crowd grow larger, their voices growing louder, she felt the first real stirrings of doubt. Had she been wrong? Some of the patrons who had come in for breakfast glanced nervously out the windows. The tension inside the diner was thick, the usual clatter of dishes and hum of conversation replaced by an uneasy silence. A few customers stood up, placing cash on the counter before quickly making their way to the door. They didn't want to be associated with the negative publicity, didn't want to be seen as supporting Ellen's actions. Ellen watched them go, her heart sinking as the bell above the door chimed again and again. Outside, George stood in front of the diner, his granddaughter by his side. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who had come to support him. It was a humbling sight, and he felt a swell of emotion rise within him. He had fought for this country, had given so much, and now, seeing these people standing with him, he knew that his fight had not been in vain. He raised a hand, and slowly, the crowd quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Thank you all for being here today," George began, his voice carrying across the crowd. It was strong, unwavering, despite the emotions that threatened to choke him. "I am humbled by your support, by your willingness to stand up for what is right. I served this country because I believed in it. I believed in the promise of freedom, of equality. And I still believe in that promise. But the fight for equality didn't end when I came home from the war. It's a fight we are still fighting today, right here, in our own community." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd, and George paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "What happened to me at Ellen's Diner was not just about me," he continued. "It was about all of us. It was about the kind of community we want to be, the kind of future we want for our children and grandchildren. We cannot allow hatred and prejudice to take root here. We have to stand together, to show that we are better than this." Monica watched her grandfather, her heart swelling with pride. His words were powerful, resonating not just with those gathered there but, she knew, with anyone who would hear his story. He spoke of his time in the military, of the friends he had lost, of the hope that had kept him going even in the darkest of times. And he spoke of the dream he had for his community, a dream of a place where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin. As George finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air. Monica stepped forward, hugging her grandfather tightly, her eyes glistening with tears. He had always been her hero, and today, he had shown everyone why. He had faced hatred with courage, had answered prejudice with dignity. He had inspired not only her but everyone who had come to stand with them. The local news had arrived not long after the protest began, their cameras capturing the scene, their reporters interviewing those who had come to lend their support. Monica watched as a young reporter approached her, microphone in hand. She took a deep breath, stepping forward, ready to share their story with an even wider audience. "Ms. Parker," the reporter began, "can you tell us why you're here today and what you hope to achieve with this protest?" Monica nodded, her expression serious. "We're here today to stand up against discrimination," she said, her voice clear. "My grandfather, George Parker, was denied service at Ellen's Diner simply because of the color of his skin. That kind of hatred has no place in our community, and we're here to show that we will not tolerate it. We want to send a message, not just to Ellen Baxter, but to anyone who thinks that kind of behavior is acceptable. We are better than this, and we will fight for a future where everyone is treated with respect and equality." The reporter nodded, her camera capturing the passion in Monica's eyes. "And what do you hope will come from this protest?" she asked. Monica glanced at her grandfather, then back at the reporter. "We hope that this will be a wake-up call," she said. "We hope that Ellen will see the harm she has caused, not just to my grandfather but to this entire community. And we hope that this will spark a larger conversation about how we treat one another, about the kind of community we want to be. This is just the beginning. We are committed to making real change, and we won't stop until we see it." The reporter thanked her, and Monica stepped back, her heart pounding. She could feel the energy in the crowd, the sense that they were part of something important, something that could make a difference. The protest continued throughout the morning, the crowd growing as more people arrived to lend their support. The chants grew louder, the signs more numerous, and Monica knew that their message was being heard. Inside the diner, Ellen watched, her heart heavy. The faces outside the window were filled with determination, their voices calling for justice. She felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, regret, perhaps, or guilt. She had thought she was doing what was right, but now, seeing the impact of her actions, she wasn't so sure. The protest was not just about her, it was about the entire community, about a future that was slipping away from her grasp. By the afternoon, the protest had drawn the attention of civil rights organizations, their representatives reaching out to Monica, offering their support. The story of George Parker and his fight for justice was beginning to gain traction beyond their small town, resonating with people across the state, and soon, across the nation. Monica knew that this was just the first step, but it was an important one. They had taken a stand, and they had shown that they would not back down. As the sun began to set, the crowd slowly began to disperse, the energy still palpable, the sense of unity unbroken. Monica stood with her grandfather, her arm around his shoulders as they watched the people leave, their hearts full. This was just the beginning, but it was a powerful start. They had made their voices heard, and they would continue to fight, together, for the change they knew was possible. Ellen sat alone in the empty diner, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn checkered floor. The protest had ended hours ago, but the echoes of their voices still seemed to linger in the air, filling the silence that had settled over her once bustling establishment. The tables were empty, the chairs stacked, and the only sound was the soft hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter. Business had been declining steadily since the incident with George Parker, and Ellen could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her, heavier with each passing day. She let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting to the framed photographs that adorned the walls of the diner. Pictures of her father, smiling proudly behind the counter, the diner full of happy patrons. She remembered the way he used to stand right where she was now, his presence larger than life. He had been a man of strong convictions, unyielding in his beliefs, and he had taught Ellen everything she knew. His voice echoed in her mind even now, telling her to be firm, to stand her ground, to never let anyone take advantage of her. He had been her role model, her guide, and she had always tried to live up to his expectations. But as she looked at the photographs, a pang of doubt struck her heart. Her father's smile seemed different now, less warm, more guarded. She remembered the way he would speak about people who were different, his bitterness, his anger. He had lived through hard times, seen the world change in ways he wasn't ready for, and that fear had turned into hatred. Ellen had grown up listening to his stories, absorbing his prejudices until they became her own. She had believed, without question, that he was right, that she was carrying on his legacy by running the diner the way he had taught her to. But now, with the diner empty and her business crumbling, Ellen wasn't so sure anymore. She reached for one of the photographs, her fingers brushing against the glass. It was an old picture, taken not long after her father had opened the diner. He looked so young, so hopeful. She wondered what he would think of her now, of the choices she had made. Would he be proud of her for standing her ground, or would he see the pain she had caused, the harm that had come from her stubbornness? Ellen wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore. The protest had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. Seeing George Parker standing there, surrounded by so many people, his voice strong and unwavering, it had forced her to confront the reality of what she had done. She had treated him with such cruelty, had dismissed his humanity without a second thought, all because of the beliefs her father had instilled in her. But now, those beliefs felt hollow, empty. The faces of the people outside her diner, the way they had looked at her with disappointment and anger, it was all starting to erode the certainty she had clung to for so long. Ellen set the photograph back down, her hands trembling slightly. She looked around the diner, at the empty booths, the counter where her father had once stood. The place felt different now, colder, emptier. It was supposed to be a place of warmth, of community, but she had turned it into something else, something that drove people away, that hurt instead of healed. She could see that now, and the realization cut deep. For so long, she had believed that she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting her father's legacy. But now, she wondered if that legacy was worth protecting at all. She thought of George Parker, of the way he had looked at her that day in the diner. There had been no hatred in his eyes, only hurt and disappointment. He had been nothing but polite, and she had treated him as though he were less than human. Ellen closed her eyes, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not backing down, but now she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, regret. The community's judgment had been harsh, but it was nothing compared to the judgment she was now facing from herself. She had been so sure, so certain that she was right, but now all she felt was doubt. The voices of the protesters echoed in her mind, their calls for justice, for equality. She had dismissed them at first, had refused to listen, but now, sitting alone in the empty diner, she couldn't ignore them any longer. The world was changing, and she was beginning to realize that if she didn't change with it, she would be left behind, alone, with nothing but her father's bitterness to keep her company. Ellen opened her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, her heart heavy. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make things right. But she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't keep going like this. The hatred, the bitterness, it was eating her alive, destroying everything her father had worked so hard to build. Maybe it was time to let go of the past, to stop holding on to the anger that had defined her for so long. Maybe it was time to find a new way forward, one that wasn't rooted in fear and prejudice. She looked around the diner one last time, the memories of her father and the past still lingering in every corner. It wouldn't be easy to change, to let go of everything she had been taught, but for the first time, Ellen thought that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. The community had turned their backs on her, but perhaps, if she found the courage to change, they might be willing to give her a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make her father's legacy something worth being proud of again. It was late afternoon when the bell above the diner's door jingled, pulling Ellen out of her thoughts. She looked up from where she sat behind the counter, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. Standing in the doorway was someone she hadn't seen in years, her sister, Mary. Ellen blinked, unsure if she was imagining things, but there Mary stood, her expression a mixture of hesitation and something softer, almost like hope. Ellen's heart skipped a beat, a mix of emotions swirling within her: shock, confusion, and a flicker of anger. Mary had left town years ago, and Ellen had never forgiven her for it. She had walked away from their family, from everything they had grown up with, and had never looked back. They had been close once, but Mary's decision to leave had driven a wedge between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Ellen set her jaw, her pride flaring up as she straightened in her seat. "Mary," she said, her voice clipped. "What are you doing here?" Mary took a step forward, her eyes scanning the empty diner before settling on Ellen. She looked older, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were still the same, kind, gentle. "Hello, Ellen," she said softly. "I heard about what happened, and I wanted to come see you." She paused, her gaze searching her sister's face. "It's been a long time." Ellen's expression hardened, her defenses rising instinctively. "It has," she replied, her voice cold. "And I suppose you've come to tell me what a terrible person I am, just like everyone else." Mary shook her head, her lips curving into a sad smile. "No, Ellen," she said. "That's not why I'm here. I came because I wanted to talk to you. I know things have been hard, and I wanted to share something with you. Something that might help." Ellen frowned, her brow furrowing. She didn't want to hear it, whatever it was. She had spent years building her life the way she thought was right, and Mary had no place coming back now, trying to change her mind. But something in Mary's eyes, something sincere, something hopeful, kept her from telling her to leave. Mary took a seat at the counter, folding her hands in front of her. "I know you're angry," she said, her voice gentle. "And I don't blame you. I left, and I know that hurt you. But I had to go, Ellen. I couldn't stay in a place where I felt like I had to hate people just because they were different." She paused, her gaze softening. "I wanted something more for myself. I wanted to let go of all the anger, all the bitterness that Dad passed down to us. It wasn't easy, but it was the best decision I ever made." Ellen crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So you left," she said, her voice sharp. "You walked away from your family, from everything we knew. And now you're back to lecture me about it." Mary shook her head again, her expression unwavering. "I'm not here to lecture you, Ellen," she said. "I'm here because I love you. Because I know how hard it is to let go of the things we were taught. Dad was a complicated man, and he did his best, but he was wrong about so many things. I know you loved him, and I did too, but his hatred, it was poison. It hurt him, and it hurt us. And it doesn't have to be that way." Ellen felt a lump form in her throat, her defenses wavering for the first time. She looked away, her gaze falling on the old photographs that lined the diner's walls. Pictures of their father, of the two of them as children, smiling and carefree. She remembered those days, the way their father had always seemed larger than life, his word's law. She had believed in him, trusted him, and she had carried his beliefs with her all these years. But now, hearing Mary's words, she felt something inside her crack, just a little. "I don't know how to change," Ellen admitted, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had allowed herself to acknowledge the doubt that had been gnawing at her since the protest. "This is all I've ever known. It's who I am." Mary reached across the counter, her hand resting on Ellen's. "It's not who you are, Ellen," she said softly. "It's what you were taught. But you can choose to be different. You can choose to let go of the anger, to see people for who they really are, not just what Dad told us they were. It's not easy, I won't lie to you. It took me years to unlearn the things we grew up with. But it was worth it. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. And I want that for you too." Ellen looked at her sister, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. She had spent so many years holding on to her father's beliefs, convinced that they were right, that they were the only way to live. But now, faced with the reality of her empty diner, her dwindling business, and the pain she had caused, she wasn't so sure anymore. The weight of it all was crushing, and she couldn't deny the truth in Mary's words. She had seen the way her father's hatred had eaten away at him, how it had left him bitter and angry until the day he died. She had promised herself she would be strong, that she wouldn't let anyone take advantage of her, but now she wondered if she had misunderstood what true strength really was. Mary squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now," she said. "I just wanted you to know that there's another way. That you don't have to carry this alone." There are people in this community who want to help, who want to see you succeed, but you have to be willing to meet them halfway. You have to be willing to change." Ellen swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to stand on her own, but now she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to lean on others. To let go of the pride that had kept her isolated, to open herself up to the possibility of something better. "I don't know if I can," Ellen whispered, her voice cracking. Mary smiled, her eyes filled with compassion. "You can," she said. "I know you can. And I'll be here to help you, every step of the way. You're my sister, Ellen, and I love you. No matter what." Ellen looked at her, the tears finally spilling over, her heart aching with the weight of everything she had held inside for so long. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility of change, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by her father's anger and her own stubborn pride. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing, like a door opening that she had never noticed before. Mary stood, walking around the counter to pull Ellen into a tight hug. Ellen hesitated for a moment before wrapping her arms around her sister, holding on as if she were a lifeline. The diner was quiet, the weight of the past still heavy, but in that moment, Ellen felt a glimmer of hope, a small, fragile seed of change that had been planted in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. Ellen stood at the edge of George Parker's driveway, her hands trembling as she took a deep breath. She had been pacing back and forth for the past few minutes, gathering the courage to walk up to the front door. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her shoulders. The conversation with her sister Mary had planted a seed in her heart, a seed that had grown slowly but steadily until she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to make things right. With a final breath, Ellen walked up the steps and knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet of the morning, and Ellen could feel her pulse quicken as she waited. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood Monica, her expression one of surprise. Ellen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She had expected this, expected the confusion, the suspicion. But she was determined to see this through. "Mrs. Baxter," Monica said, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" Ellen met her gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm here to see George," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak with him." Monica hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Ellen's face. She could see the nervousness there, the vulnerability that Ellen was trying so hard to hide. After a moment, Monica stepped aside, nodding. "He's inside," she said, her voice softening. "Come in." Ellen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, stepping through the doorway into the warmth of the Parker home. Monica led her to the living room, where George sat in his favorite armchair, a newspaper in his hands. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Ellen. "Ellen," he said, his voice even, though there was a hint of surprise in his tone. He set the newspaper aside, his gaze fixed on her. Ellen felt her heart clench at the sight of him, this man she had wronged so deeply, who had done nothing to deserve the way she had treated him. She took a step forward, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her. "Mr. Parker," she began, her voice trembling. I know I don't deserve your time, but I came here today because I need to apologize. I need you to know how sorry I am for what I did." George remained silent, his eyes never leaving her face. Ellen swallowed, her throat tight as she continued. "I was wrong. I was so wrong to treat you the way I did. I let my pride, my fear, and the things I was taught cloud my judgment. I hurt you, and I hurt this community, and for that, I am truly sorry." Her voice broke, and she blinked back tears, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I know that words can't undo the pain I've caused," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I want to be better. And if there's anything I can do to make this right, please, tell me." There was a long silence, the weight of Ellen's words hanging in the air. George studied her, his expression unreadable. Monica watched from the doorway, her heart pounding as she waited for her grandfather's response. She could see the sincerity in Ellen's eyes, the vulnerability in her posture. This was not the same woman who had thrown her grandfather out of the diner. This was someone who was trying, truly trying, to make amends. Finally, George spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Ellen," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I've seen a lot in my time. I've seen hatred, I've seen anger, and I've seen people change. I won't lie to you, what you did hurt me deeply. It brought back memories I had hoped to leave behind. But I also know that holding on to anger, holding on to bitterness, it only poisons the soul." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You coming here today, admitting you were wrong, that takes courage. And I respect that." Ellen looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. Does that mean you forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. George nodded slowly, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yes, Ellen," he said. "I forgive you." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Why don't you sit down? We can talk." Ellen hesitated for a moment before nodding, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and emotion. She moved to the chair, sitting down across from George, her hands still trembling slightly. Monica watched as her grandfather and Ellen began to talk, their voices low and steady. She saw the way Ellen's posture relaxed, the way George's expression softened as they spoke. It was a conversation that was long overdue, a conversation about their pasts, about the things that had shaped them, and about the hope they both had for the future. Ellen spoke of her father, of the bitterness that had been passed down to her, and how she had never questioned it until now. George listened, his eyes filled with understanding, nodding as she spoke. "My father was a proud man," Ellen said, her voice soft. "He taught me to be strong, to stand my ground. But somewhere along the way, I think I misunderstood what strength really was. I thought it meant never admitting I was wrong, never showing weakness. But now, I see that real strength is in letting go of the anger, in being willing to change." George nodded, his gaze gentle. "It's never easy to let go of the things we've been taught," he said. "But it's worth it. Change is never easy, but it's how we grow. And it's how we make the world a better place for those who come after us." He paused, his eyes meeting Ellen's. "You have a chance now, Ellen. A chance to make things right, not just with me, but with this entire community. And I believe you can do it." Ellen felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away quickly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, George," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance." George smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Ellen feel lighter than she had in years. "We all deserve a second chance," he said. "It's what we do with it that matters." They continued to talk, their voices growing more relaxed, more open. Monica watched from the doorway, her own eyes glistening with tears. She had hoped for this, for reconciliation, for understanding, but seeing it unfold before her was more powerful than she could have imagined. It was proof that change was possible, that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal with time and effort. After a while, Monica stepped into the room, a gentle smile on her face. "Would anyone like some tea?" she asked, her voice soft. George looked up, his eyes twinkling as he nodded. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," he said. Ellen smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. She had been so nervous coming here, so afraid of what George might say, but now, sitting in his living room, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. This was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many people she needed to make amends with, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. As Monica left the room to make the tea, Ellen turned back to George, her heart full. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady. "I want to be part of the change. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." George nodded, his smile widening. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. "One step at a time, Ellen. One step at a time." And in that moment, Ellen knew that she was ready. Ready to let go of the past, to embrace the possibility of a better future, and to be part of the community she had once pushed away. It wouldn't be easy, but with George and Monica by her side, she knew she could do it. This was her new beginning, and she was ready to make it count. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Ellen's diner, illuminating the empty tables and the old checkered floor. Ellen stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in, the quiet, the memories, the ghosts of what had been. Her conversation with George had stayed with her, replaying in her mind again and again. She had come to realize that the diner, her father's legacy, didn't have to be a monument to outdated beliefs. It could be something new, something that honored the good parts of her father's memory while letting go of the bitterness he had held onto. It could be a place of hope and unity, a symbol of change. And Ellen was ready to make it so. Ellen took a deep breath, her eyes glancing around the room. She knew she couldn't do this alone, and there was only one person who came to mind. She picked up the phone and dialed Monica's number, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for her to pick up. When Monica answered, her voice was cautious, but there was a warmth there as well. "Monica, it's Ellen," she said, her voice steady. I need your help. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I want to change the diner. I want it to be a place that celebrates diversity, that honors veterans like your grandfather, people of all backgrounds. I can't do this by myself, and I was hoping that you and George might be willing to help me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ellen held her breath, waiting for Monica's response. Finally, Monica spoke, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Of course, Ellen. We'd be happy to help. This is exactly what we've been hoping for, a chance to bring the community together, to heal. I'll talk to Grandpa, and we'll get started." Ellen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Monica," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I really appreciate it." And just like that, a new chapter began. Within days, word spread through the community about Ellen's plans to transform the diner, and people began to show up, ready to help, ready to be part of something bigger. Monica and George arrived early on the first day of renovations, and they were soon joined by neighbors, friends, and even some people Ellen had never met before. It was a mix of young and old, people from all walks of life, coming together with one common goal: to turn the diner into a place that celebrated unity, respect, and the contributions of veterans. Ellen stood by the front door, watching as people carried in supplies, paint cans, brushes, decorations. It was overwhelming, in the best possible way. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see George, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Looks like you've got quite a crew here," he said, his voice full of pride. Ellen smiled, her heart swelling. "I never imagined so many people would want to help," she admitted. It's incredible." George nodded, his gaze drifting around the room. "People want to be part of something meaningful," he said. "And you've given them that chance." Ellen looked around the diner, her eyes welling with tears as she watched the community come together. This was what her father had missed out on, the joy that came from connection, from opening one's heart to others. And now, she was determined not to make the same mistake. Work on the diner began in earnest, with everyone pitching in wherever they could. The walls were repainted, the old, faded colors replaced with bright, inviting hues that made the space feel warm and welcoming. Murals were added, scenes that depicted veterans of all backgrounds standing together, side by side, their faces filled with determination and pride. It was a celebration of the community's diversity, a reminder of the sacrifices that so many had made for the country. Monica worked alongside Ellen, the two women sharing stories and laughter as they painted and cleaned. At first, it was awkward. There were still so many unspoken words between them, so much history to overcome. But as the days went by, they began to find a rhythm, their conversations growing more open, more honest. Ellen found herself sharing stories of her father, the good moments, the times when he had been kind and loving, before the bitterness had taken hold. And Monica listened, her heart softening as she came to understand the complexities of Ellen's past. George, too, was a constant presence, offering advice, lending a hand, and sharing his own stories of service. He spoke of the friends he had made during the war, men from all walks of life, from different races, different backgrounds. They had fought together, bled together, and that bond had transcended any differences they might have had. He wanted the diner to reflect that spirit of unity, and Ellen was determined to honor his vision. As the renovations continued, more and more people joined in, bringing food, supplies, and their own stories to share. The diner became a hub of activity, a place where people came not just to work, but to connect, to be part of something meaningful. Ellen found herself working side by side with people she had once looked down upon, people she had judged without ever really knowing them. And as she listened to their stories, as she saw their kindness, their willingness to help, she felt her heart begin to change. One afternoon, as they were putting the finishing touches on the new mural, a young boy approached Ellen, a small American flag clutched in his hand. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss Ellen," he said, his voice shy, "can I help put this up? My dad was a soldier too." Ellen felt a lump form in her throat as she knelt down, her eyes meeting his. "Of course you can," she said, her voice gentle. Your dad must be very brave." The boy nodded, his face lighting up with pride. Ellen took his hand, guiding him to the wall, and together they found the perfect spot for the flag. As she stepped back, watching the boy's face light up, Ellen felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. This was what the diner was meant to be, a place where everyone felt seen, where everyone belonged. The day of the reopening finally arrived, and the diner was nearly unrecognizable. The walls were adorned with photographs of veterans from the community, their stories displayed alongside their images. The old worn furniture had been replaced with new tables and chairs, each one painted with messages of hope and unity. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked pies and the sound of laughter and conversation as people gathered, excited to see the transformation. Ellen stood behind the counter, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd that had gathered. She saw Monica, standing with George, both of them smiling at her, their eyes filled with pride. She saw Mary, her sister, standing near the back, her eyes shining with tears. And she saw the faces of the people who had come to help, people who had once been strangers, but who now felt like family. Ellen took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This diner has been a part of my family for many years, and for a long time I thought I knew what it was supposed to be. But I've come to realize that it's not about holding on to the past, it's about creating something new, something better. This diner is for all of you, for this community, for the veterans who have given so much, and for everyone who believes in the power of change." There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Ellen felt her heart swell as she stepped out from behind the counter, her eyes meeting George's. He nodded, his eyes filled with warmth, and Ellen knew that she had finally found her place, not in the past, not in the bitterness and anger that had once defined her, but in the hope and unity of the community she had once pushed away. As the crowd began to move through the diner, admiring the changes, sharing stories, and enjoying the food, Ellen felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had let go of the anger, the fear, the need to prove herself. She had opened her heart, and in doing so, she had found something she never knew she was missing, a sense of belonging, of connection, of true fulfillment. This was her father's legacy, not the hatred he had carried, but the love she had found in letting it go. Ellen looked around the diner, her eyes taking in the smiles, the laughter, the warmth that filled the space. This was the new beginning she had dreamed of, a place where everyone was welcome, where everyone belonged. And as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had made it possible, Ellen knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would continue to build, to grow, to create a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before. Ellen stood in the middle of the diner, the soft morning light streaming through the windows and casting a golden glow across the room. The conversation with George had shifted something inside her, like a door she never knew existed had been opened. For so long, she had clung to her father's ideals, believing she was doing the right thing by upholding the values he had passed down to her. But now, she understood that true strength lay in embracing change, in choosing unity over division. The diner, her father's legacy, could be something more, something that celebrated the diversity of the community, that honored veterans like George, and that brought people together instead of pushing them apart. And Ellen was ready to make that change. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Monica's number. When Monica answered, Ellen took a deep breath, her voice filled with both determination and vulnerability. "Monica, it's Ellen. I want to change the diner. I want it to be a place that celebrates everyone, a place that honors the veterans of our community and welcomes people of all backgrounds. I can't do it alone, and I was hoping that you and George might be willing to help me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Ellen could hear the surprise in Monica's voice when she finally responded. "Ellen, I'm so glad you called. Of course, we'll help. This is exactly what Grandpa and I have been hoping for, a chance to bring the community together, to create something new." Ellen felt a sense of relief wash over her, a smile breaking across her face. She knew that this was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. Within days, word spread throughout the town about Ellen's plans to transform the diner. People began to show up, ready to lend a hand, eager to be part of this new chapter. Ellen stood at the front door of the diner one morning, watching as neighbors and friends arrived, carrying supplies and tools. It was overwhelming, the sheer number of people who had come to help, people of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life. They had all heard what had happened, and they were here to support the transformation, to make the diner into something they could all be proud of. Monica and George arrived early that morning, both of them smiling as they approached Ellen. George placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with warmth. "Looks like you've got quite a crew here," he said, his voice full of pride. Ellen smiled, her eyes welling with tears. "I never imagined so many people would want to help," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. It's incredible." George nodded, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "People want to be part of something meaningful," he said. "And you've given them that opportunity." Work on the diner began in earnest, with everyone pitching in wherever they could. The walls were stripped of their old, faded paint and given a fresh coat, bright, warm colors that made the space feel inviting and vibrant. Murals began to take shape on the walls, scenes depicting veterans of all backgrounds standing together, their faces filled with strength and determination. It was a tribute to the sacrifices made by those who had served, a reminder that their contributions were valued and honored. Monica worked closely with Ellen, the two women side by side as they painted, cleaned, and organized. At first, it was awkward. There were still so many unspoken words between them, so much history to navigate. But as the days passed, they began to find a rhythm, their conversations becoming more open, more genuine. Ellen found herself sharing stories about her father, the good memories, the times when he had been kind and gentle. Monica listened, her heart softening as she came to understand the complexities of Ellen's upbringing. George was a constant presence, lending a hand wherever he could and offering advice. He spoke of his time in the military, of the friendships he had formed with people from all walks of life. He told stories of the camaraderie that had developed between soldiers, a bond that transcended race, religion, and background. It was that spirit of unity that he wanted the diner to embody, and Ellen was determined to make that vision a reality. As the renovations continued, more and more people came to help, bringing food, supplies, and their own stories. The diner became a hub of activity, a place where people came not just to work, but to connect. Ellen found herself working alongside people she had once looked down upon, people she had judged without ever really knowing them. And as she listened to their stories, as she saw their kindness and their willingness to help, she felt her heart begin to change. One afternoon, as they were putting the finishing touches on a mural, a young boy approached Ellen, a small American flag clutched in his hand. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss Ellen," he said shyly, "can I help put this up? My dad was a soldier too." Ellen felt a lump form in her throat as she knelt down, her eyes meeting his. "Of course you can," she said, her voice gentle. "Your dad must be very brave." The boy nodded, his face lighting up with pride. Ellen took his hand and led him to the wall, finding the perfect spot for the flag. As she watched the boy's face light up, Ellen felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. This was what the diner was meant to be, a place where everyone felt seen, where everyone belonged. The day of the reopening finally arrived, and the diner was transformed. The walls were adorned with photographs of veterans from the community, their stories displayed alongside their images. The old furniture had been replaced with new tables and chairs, each one painted with messages of hope, unity, and respect. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked pies, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the space as people gathered, eager to see the transformation. Ellen stood behind the counter, her heart pounding as she looked out at the crowd that had gathered. She saw Monica and George standing together, both of them smiling at her, their eyes filled with pride. She saw her sister Mary, standing near the back, tears glistening in her eyes. And she saw the faces of the people who had come to help, people who had once been strangers but who now felt like family. Ellen took a deep breath, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "This diner has been a part of my family for many years, and for a long time, I thought I knew what it was supposed to be. But I've come to realize that it's not about holding on to the past, it's about creating something new, something better. This diner is for all of you, for this community, for the veterans who have given so much, and for everyone who believes in the power of change." There was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Ellen felt her heart swell as she stepped out from behind the counter, her eyes meeting George's. He nodded, his eyes filled with warmth, and Ellen knew that she had finally found her place, not in the past, not in the bitterness and anger that had once defined her, but in the hope and unity of the community she had once pushed away. As the crowd began to move through the diner, admiring the changes, sharing stories, and enjoying the food, Ellen felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had let go of the anger, the fear, and the need to prove herself. She had opened her heart, and in doing so, she had found something she never knew she was missing, a sense of belonging, of connection, of true fulfillment. This was her father's legacy, not the hatred he had carried, but the love she had found in letting it go. Ellen looked around the diner, her eyes taking in the smiles, the laughter, and the warmth that filled the space. This was the new beginning she had dreamed of, a place where everyone was welcome, where everyone belonged. And as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had made it possible, Ellen knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would continue to build, to grow, and to create a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before. The day of the grand reopening had finally arrived. The air was filled with excitement as people gathered outside Ellen's diner, now rechristened the Unity Café. The bright morning sun shone down on the small southern town, illuminating the newly painted facade of the building. The fresh sign above the entrance, the Unity Café, gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of a new beginning for both the diner and the community. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, spilling out into the street, their faces filled with anticipation. Friends, neighbors, families, and even people who had never set foot in the diner before were all there, eager to see the transformation that had taken place. Children held colorful balloons, and the hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by laughter and the occasional cheer. It was a day of celebration, a day that symbolized hope and change. Standing at the front of the crowd, George, Monica, Ellen, and Mary stood side by side. George held a large pair of ceremonial scissors, his hand steady as he glanced at the people around him. Ellen, standing next to him, felt a wave of emotion as she looked at the crowd. She saw familiar faces, people who had once turned away from her in disappointment but were now here to support her. She also saw new faces, people who had come to witness the change, to be part of something positive. And beside her stood Mary, her sister, smiling at her with pride. It was more than Ellen could have hoped for, and it filled her with a sense of peace. Monica stepped forward, her voice strong as she addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "This is more than just the reopening of a diner. It's the beginning of a new chapter for our community, a chapter that celebrates unity, understanding, and the power of change." She turned to George, handing him the scissors. "And now, I'd like to invite my grandfather, George Parker, to do the honors." George stepped forward, the crowd growing quiet as he held the scissors aloft. He looked out at the people gathered before him, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "Today is a day of new beginnings," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It's a day to celebrate the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the belief that we can all change for the better." He paused, his eyes meeting Ellen's, then Monica's, and finally Mary's. "This cafe is a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together, when we let go of hatred and choose love instead." With that, George brought the scissors down, cutting the red ribbon that stretched across the entrance. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers filling the air as the ribbon fell away, officially opening the Unity Café. Ellen felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude. This was the moment she had dreamed of, a moment of healing, of hope, of a community coming together to celebrate something beautiful. The doors to the Unity Café were opened, and people began to file inside, eager to see the changes that had been made. The once faded walls were now vibrant, adorned with photographs that told the story of the community. There were pictures of veterans from all backgrounds, their stories displayed alongside their images, a tribute to their service and sacrifices. There were photos of families, of children playing, of moments of joy and connection. And there were historical photographs, images that captured moments of unity, of people standing together in the face of adversity. The walls were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the belief that, despite our differences, we are all connected. The atmosphere inside the cafe was warm and inviting. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pie filled the air, and people moved from table to table, admiring the decorations and sharing stories. Ellen stood behind the counter, her heart swelling as she watched the scene unfold. She saw people laughing, embracing, reconnecting. She saw children pointing at the photographs, asking questions, their parents taking the time to share the stories behind the images. It was everything she had hoped for, a place where people could come together, where everyone felt welcome. As the crowd settled, George made his way to the center of the room, standing on a small platform that had been set up for the occasion. He cleared his throat, and the room grew quiet, all eyes turning to him. Ellen watched from behind the counter, her hands resting on the smooth surface, her eyes fixed on George. "Thank you all for being here today," George began, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "Today we stand in a place that has been transformed, not just in the way it looks, but in what it represents. The Unity Cafe is more than just a diner. It's a symbol of change, of growth, of the power of forgiveness." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I know that change isn't always easy. It's hard to let go of the past, to admit that we were wrong. But it is in that vulnerability, in that willingness to change, that we find our true strength." George's eyes found Ellen's, and he smiled. Ellen has shown incredible courage in choosing to change, in choosing to let go of the anger and fear that once held her back. She has opened her heart, and in doing so, she has opened the doors of this cafe to all of us. And for that, I am deeply grateful. Ellen felt her throat tighten, her eyes filling with tears as the crowd turned to look at her, their faces filled with warmth and support. George continued, his voice growing stronger. "We all have a choice. We can choose to hold on to hatred, to let it fester and divide us. Or we can choose to let it go, to see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors, as friends, as family. Today I choose love. I choose forgiveness. And I hope that each of you will join me in that choice, not just today, but every day." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Together, we can create a community that is stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before." The room was silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the space, echoing off the walls. People rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, their faces filled with emotion. Ellen wiped at her eyes, her heart full as she watched George step down from the platform, Monica moving to embrace him, her eyes glistening with tears. Ellen stepped out from behind the counter, making her way through the crowd. People stopped her, shaking her hand, thanking her, offering words of support. She felt overwhelmed by the kindness, by the sense of connection that filled the room. When she finally reached George, she hesitated for a moment before pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." George hugged her back, his smile gentle. "We all deserve a second chance, Ellen," he said. "And you've made the most of yours. I'm proud of you." Ellen pulled back, her eyes meeting his, and she nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the day continued, the Unity Cafe buzzed with life, people sharing stories, enjoying the food, and celebrating the new beginning that had been created. Ellen looked around, her eyes taking in the smiles, the laughter, the warmth that filled the space. This was what she had dreamed of, a place where everyone was welcome, where everyone belonged. And as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had made it possible, Ellen knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would continue to build, to grow, and to create a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before. The sun was shining brightly on the day of the grand reopening, casting a warm glow over the crowd that had gathered outside the building that was once known as Ellen's Diner. Now renamed the Unity Cafe, the facade had been transformed with fresh coats of paint, vibrant flowers lining the entrance, and a brand new sign hanging proudly above the door. The air was filled with a palpable sense of excitement, the anticipation of something new and meaningful, a promise of change and growth for the entire town. The street in front of the cafe was filled with townspeople of all ages, from young children clutching colorful balloons to elderly neighbors standing with proud smiles. The crowd extended down the block, people standing shoulder to shoulder, united by a common desire to witness this significant moment. The atmosphere buzzed with chatter and laughter, a hopeful energy rippling through everyone present. George Parker stood at the front of the crowd, his hands steady as he held a large pair of ceremonial scissors. Beside him stood Monica, her hand resting gently on his arm, her eyes reflecting pride and admiration. Next to Monica stood Ellen and Mary, Ellen's eyes glistening with emotion, and Mary offering her sister a reassuring smile. For Ellen, this was more than just the reopening of her diner. It was a moment of transformation, a symbol of her willingness to change, to open her heart and embrace the community she had once kept at a distance. Monica stepped forward and addressed the crowd, her voice carrying over the excited murmurs. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. "This is a very special day for all of us. The Unity Cafe represents more than just a new name, it represents a new beginning for our community. A place where everyone is welcome, where we celebrate our differences, and where we come together as one. Today is about unity, about hope, and about the power of change. She turned to George, her smile widening. And now, I'd like to invite my grandfather, George Parker, to do the honors. George nodded, his gaze moving to the crowd as he took a step forward, the ceremonial scissors in hand. He looked out at the people who had gathered, a gentle smile spreading across his face. Today, he began, his voice strong and clear, we are here to celebrate not just the reopening of a diner, but the beginning of something new. A place that belongs to all of us. A place where we honor our veterans, our community members, and the ties that bind us together. This cafe is a symbol of what we can achieve when we choose to come together, when we choose to forgive, to understand, and to grow. With a deep breath, George brought the scissors down, cutting the red ribbon that stretched across the entrance. The crowd erupted in applause, cheers and whistles echoing through the street as the ribbon fell away. The doors to the Unity Cafe swung open, and the people began to move forward, eager to see the transformation that had taken place inside. As they entered, they were greeted by the sight of a space that was completely different from the diner they had once known. The walls were adorned with photographs that told the story of the community. Pictures of veterans in uniform, standing proudly, their stories written beneath their images. There were photographs of families, children playing, community events, and historical moments that highlighted the town's journey towards unity and understanding. Each image was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a reminder of what could be achieved when people chose to come together. The cafe was warm and welcoming, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pies filling the air. Tables and chairs had been rearranged to create a more open and inclusive atmosphere, encouraging conversation and connection. People moved from photo to photo, admiring the stories, pointing out familiar faces, and sharing their own memories. The atmosphere was one of warmth and camaraderie, the walls themselves seeming to echo the laughter and chatter that filled the space. George made his way to a small platform that had been set up in the center of the room. He cleared his throat, and slowly, the crowd quieted, their attention turning to him. Ellen watched from behind the counter, her heart swelling as she saw the way the people looked at George, with respect, admiration, and love. "Thank you all for being here today," George began, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "This cafe, the Unity Cafe, is more than just a place to eat. It is a place where we celebrate the values that make us strong: love, understanding, respect, and forgiveness. We all have a past, and we all have moments we wish we could change. But today, we have the opportunity to start fresh, to build something better, not just for ourselves, but for our children, for future generations." He paused, his eyes finding Ellen's across the room. He nodded to her, a warm smile touching his lips. "Ellen has shown us what it means to have true courage. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more courage to make things right. She has opened her heart, and in doing so, she has opened the doors of this cafe to all of us. And for that, I am deeply grateful." Ellen felt her throat tighten, her eyes brimming with tears as the crowd turned to look at her, their faces filled with warmth and acceptance. George continued, his voice growing stronger. "Forgiveness and understanding are not easy. They require us to let go of our fears, our prejudices, and our pride. But when we do, we make room for something greater. We make room for love, for connection, and for unity. Today, I stand here, not just as a veteran, not just as a member of this community, but as someone who believes in the power of change. I believe that together, we can create a community that is stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of George's words settling over everyone present. Then, slowly, the applause began, soft at first, then growing louder, until the entire room was on its feet, cheering and clapping. Ellen wiped at her eyes, her heart full as she watched George step down from the platform, Monica moving to embrace him, her own eyes glistening with tears. Ellen stepped out from behind the counter, moving through the crowd as people stopped her, shaking her hand, thanking her, offering words of support and encouragement. She felt overwhelmed by the kindness, by the sense of connection that filled the room. When she finally reached George, she hesitated for a moment before wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." George hugged her back, his smile gentle. "You earned this, Ellen," he said. "You've shown us all what it means to change, to grow. I'm proud of you." Ellen pulled back, her eyes meeting his, and she nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the day continued, The Unity Cafe was filled with life, people sharing stories, enjoying the food, and celebrating the new beginning that had been created. Ellen looked around, her eyes taking in the smiles, the laughter, the warmth that filled the space. This was what she had dreamed of, a place where everyone was welcome, where everyone belonged. And as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had made it possible, Ellen knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would continue to build, to grow, and to create a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before. The afternoon sun bathed the Unity Cafe in a soft, golden light, the warmth seeping through the large windows and filling the room with a comforting glow. The once divided town had gathered inside, people of all backgrounds sitting together, their laughter and conversation echoing throughout the transformed space. The walls, adorned with photographs of veterans and community members, seemed to hum with life as people pointed, smiled, and shared the stories behind the images. Ellen stood behind the counter, her hands moving deftly as she poured coffee and plated slices of pie. Her smile was genuine, her eyes bright as she greeted each person who approached. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of belonging, a warmth that filled her heart and erased the coldness that had once taken hold. She saw familiar faces, people she had once pushed away with her harsh words and closed heart, and now they met her gaze with smiles and nods of appreciation. Ellen knew she had come a long way, and though there was still much to learn, she was ready for the journey. Across the room, George and Monica sat together at a table, watching the scene unfold. George's eyes were filled with pride as he looked around, taking in the sight of people laughing, sharing stories, and building connections. Monica leaned in closer to her grandfather, her smile mirroring his. "Look at what you've done, Grandpa," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've helped bring everyone together. You've given this town something truly special." George shook his head, his eyes twinkling. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We all did this, together. It took everyone here, choosing to let go of the past, to open their hearts and embrace something new." He glanced at Ellen, who was laughing with a customer at the counter. "And it took courage, a lot of courage, from people like Ellen to make this happen." Monica nodded, her heart swelling with pride. She knew how far her grandfather had come, how much he had endured, and how tirelessly he had worked to make this moment possible. And she knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so much to build, but for now, they could take a moment to appreciate how far they had come. A young child approached their table, his eyes wide as he stared at the medals pinned to George's chest. He looked up at George, his voice filled with curiosity. "Mister, are you a real soldier?" he asked, his small finger pointing at the medals. George smiled, his heart warming at the boy's innocence. "I was," George said, his voice gentle. "A long time ago." He gestured to the seat beside him, and the boy climbed up, his eyes never leaving the medals. "Would you like to hear a story?" George asked, his smile widening. The boy nodded eagerly, his eyes shining with excitement. George glanced at Monica, who gave him an encouraging nod, her smile soft. He turned back to the boy, his voice steady as he began to speak. "These medals, they tell a story of courage, of friendship, and of standing up for what's right. But most importantly, they remind me that we're all stronger when we stand together, when we help each other and look out for one another." As George spoke, people nearby began to listen, their conversations quieting as they turned to hear his words. The cafe grew still, the only sound George's steady, warm voice as he shared his story, a story of courage, of hope, and of unity. Ellen paused behind the counter, her eyes misting over as she listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. This was what she had hoped for, a place where people could come together, where stories could be shared, and where the lessons of the past could guide the future. The Unity Cafe was more than just a diner now. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose love over hatred, when they chose to build bridges instead of walls. And as George finished his story, the young boy's eyes wide with wonder, the room erupted in applause, not just for George, but for the journey they had all taken together. Ellen looked around, her heart full as she saw the smiles, the laughter, the warmth that filled the room. She knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still challenges ahead, still work to be done. But for now, she was content to stand here, in this place she had helped create, surrounded by people who had become her family. Together, they had turned the page, started a new chapter, and created something beautiful. And Ellen knew, deep in her heart, that they would continue to build a community that was stronger, kinder, and more united than ever before.